All right. Well, as Scott said, last week, for those of us who weren't with us, Heidi Kunke from DEP spoke, and she spoke about climate change and the climate action plan kind of at the state level. So I'm going to focus more on climate change at the local level and how it's going to impact Greater Reading, why we must respond, and what we must do. But to make sure that we're all on the same page, I do want to start off with just the basics of climate change science. I'm not a scientist, so I'm not going to go into detail. But basically, we have greenhouse gases. These are emissions largely from human sources that are in the atmosphere. And over time, we've had this kind of cyclical pattern in these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But you see very off to the right there, just the last couple 100 years, industrialization, the emissions that humans are generating has shot that concentration up to over 400 parts per million compared to a previous high of 300. Okay, so this is an abnormal level of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. What that does is those greenhouse gases, by their name, they let sunlight in to the planet, but they trap the heat from escaping. So as we've seen the concentration of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere increase, we've seen a similar increase in global temperatures. And although temperature is not the only change we're seeing, that's kind of the place to start. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today, is those greenhouse gas emissions. So first of all, very important, who is affected by climate change? Well, first of all, everyone. Climate change is a global challenge, but its impacts are felt locally. Most of the time, they're felt most intensely by frontline populations. These are typically areas that are at risk by some kind of hazard. So, for example, low-lying areas with flood risk near rivers or near the ocean often affects disadvantaged populations the most. People who don't have the resources, don't have the educational attainment, who are often minority populations. And if you can imagine, I'm really describing Reading here. We are a low-lying area near the Schuylkill River. We know we have flood risk. About a third of our population lives below the poverty line. Over 60% is Hispanic. Only about 2/3 have a high school degree, and only about 10% have a bachelor's degree or higher. So Reading is very much a frontline population. Climate change is already happening, so we know that everyone is affected, but our children and our grandchildren will be affected the most because we're going to see more intense effects as time goes on. And while climate change has traditionally been thought of as an environmental problem, it's really not. It's a multi-pronged issue. It affects our economy, our social structure, our public health, and of course, our people. In that way, it is very similar to COVID-19. COVID-19 is a public health issue. It's a virus issue that doctors and nurses should care about, but we're seeing huge effects all across our society because it impacts us in so many ways. Now, in general, climate change is going to make southeastern Pennsylvania look more like southeastern United States. It's going to get hotter, it's going to get more humid, and it's going to get wetter throughout the year. Here in this region, we know that our largest risk factors with climate change are heat waves and extreme hot days, as well as severe weather, rainstorms, and flooding. This is looking at the science and looking at our natural resources, and these are the things most likely to be risks that increase in the future. So today and in the future, I want you to think about, with these increased risks, what happens to our community systems, right? If it's very hot, we need AC, we need cooling. How is that affected by climate change? How about water and wastewater treatment, infrastructure, housing? Okay, think about these things as we go through today. So I do want to talk a little bit about some local impacts. We talked about agriculture last week. Agriculture is going to be mixed. There's going to be some benefits, longer frost-free growing seasons, warmer weather. But plants generally don't like extreme heat, and they don't like swimming when they're not used to being underwater. So we're going to see some complex effects there. If you think about 2018 and the flooding we had impacting agriculture around the country. With energy, we're going to see an overall increase in energy demand for cooling in the summer. And we might see less demand for heating in the winter, but it's going to be an overall increase in the amount of energy we need. And that's going to have a couple problems. It's not been such an issue here, but power outages on extreme heat days when the AC is on full blast can actually overload our grid and cause blackouts. And generally, usually the biggest source of outbreak of outages are severe weather. So high winds, thunderstorms, hurricanes. We're going to see more of those in the future, and that can have a larger impact on power outages. We've already had quite a few so far this year. Outdoor recreation is going to be majorly impacted. Heidi mentioned last week that skiing and snowboarding probably won't really exist by mid-century. And here in Pennsylvania, we are very fond of trout and our fishing. Trout is a cold water fish, and it really does not do well in warmer waters, and we're going to see a major impact there. Public health came up a lot last week. Our risk factors are going to increase, things like air pollution, length and the severity of the allergy season. Last week, we learned that Pennsylvania is the leading state with Lyme disease, and we're going to see more ticks, mosquitoes, waterborne pathogens. So all of those risk factors around our health are going to reduce our health outcomes. We're going to have more respiratory illnesses. We're going to have more mortality from heat-related illness. And the shout out to Berk's Nature, there's a picture here of their Nature RX program. They're focused on getting people outside. And more severe weather, more extreme heat is going to impact our recreation, our fitness, the time we spend outside, and that's going to have an impact on our overall health. I have to talk about water. Unlike the western part of the country, we are perhaps lucky in that we're not going to be facing an increased risk of drought and the wildfires that often come with that. But on the other hand, we're going to be seeing increased rainfall, increased intense rainfall that will cause erosion, it'll cause flood risk for both urban and rural communities. And with all that is going to come increased contamination, increased pollution from runoff. And we're going to have to be concerned about the quality of our water and the environment's ability to kind of self-regulate it. And then with wildlife, we won't go into too much, but if you think about Hawk Mountain, it's a huge resource in our community. The migration patterns of many species are changing, as well as the food chain, and there's going to be cascading effects in the ecosystem. So that's not going to affect just the wildlife, but the way that we interact with it. I said this already, but it's very important to understand that climate change is not just something that will happen in the future, it's happening already. If you look at the temperature measured right here in Berks County by the airport from 1980 to 2010, you graph the average temperature. If you compare the last decade from 2010 to 2019, the only year that was not an above average temperature was 2014. Right? So 2012, 2016, almost 3 degrees above average temperatures. Talking about the precipitation, we all remember 2018. It was a very bad year for a lot of things. It was bad for agriculture. It was bad for getting outside. We had so much rain. And it was very heavily concentrated in the kind of summer to fall when we saw extreme flooding. And you can see that here. A huge spike in precipitation compared to our normal monthly averages. And we're not alone in this. This is a graph or a map from NOAA. Reading had about 20 inches more rainfall in 2018 than normal. That's about a third increase. And so did much of the East Coast, the Southeast, the Midwest. That had big impacts on agriculture and other parts of our society. As I mentioned earlier, out west, they have much more of an issue with drought and the fires that come with that. This had very real impacts here in the city of Reading. This is a picture from 2015 from the Reading Eagle. We had a big rainstorm and it actually blew out one of our storm drain systems down in Heritage Park. So that's very real public infrastructure damage from extreme weather events. 2018, coming back to that, we set a new record with a minimum temperature that was 76 degrees, which is higher than the previous of 1901 and 2002, where the high minimum temperature was 75 degrees. We had above average precipitation. Okay, these things are happening. Already this year, we've seen 2 instances of severe wind damage. The top picture is my staff had to remove a very large metal roof that blew off a building and landed, thankfully, just in the street. There was no harm done to anyone. And then just the other day, we had a picture here from the Reading Eagle. Pagoda had some wind damage as well. So these things are already happening. And it's important to note that each of these individually can be described as weather, something that happens over a given period of hours or maybe days. But the increased severity and the increased likelihood of these events happening, that is because our climate is changing. So with that context, I want to take us back to 2006. We see flooding down on the riverfront near Rack and Penske. We go back even further to Hurricane Agnes, almost 50 years ago now. We remember that these severe weather events, this flooding, can have very major impacts on our community. It can upset daily life, and it can displace people, destroy businesses, and do a lot of lasting damage. Again, each individual event might be weather. It's hard to relate them to specifically climate change, but we know that these events are coming with increased frequency. In Texas, they had 3 100-year floods in just over a decade. These are floods that are supposed to happen maybe 1% likelihood every year, and they had 3 of them in a decade. Okay, so these are happening, and we need to be prepared for them, which is why we must respond. Climate change is happening now. We need to mitigate, which means we need to reduce our community's impact on climate change, and we need to adapt, which means we need to recognize the risks that are likely and prepare for them. It's about making us a more resilient community with a strong economy, a cohesive and healthy society, and a clean environment. We need to look at all 3 pillars of sustainability. And again, not just an environmental movement, we need to stop saying that we're trying to save the planet, because the truth is the planet was here before us, the planet will be here after us, it will be fine. What we need to talk about is how we are providing for ourselves. Right? We rely on the planet for clean water, clean air, food, shelter. If we don't take care of our environments, we're putting ourselves at risk. And finally, power and responsibility. Not everyone's going to have equal power to address climate change. And those of us who do, we have a responsibility to take some action. So that's a lot. I'm going to switch it up here and talk a little bit about what we are doing to address climate change. At the global level, the Paris Climate Agreement of 2015 is kind of the major effort to address climate change. Our goal was to maintain global temperature increases to 2 degrees Celsius and try and limit them to 1.5 if possible. And as part of that, the United States agreed to an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Now, the current administration has decided that the United States is going to withdraw, and that's going to take effect the day after the scheduled election this year, in November. But even though the federal government is not taking leadership on this, others are. Pennsylvania is one of 25 states and territories that has agreed to meet those same targets set out in the Paris Agreement. There are over 400 cities, including 15 in Pennsylvania, who've met those or are agreed to meet those goals. And there's almost 4,000 businesses, universities, faith groups, all kinds of entities who are, again, trying to meet those goals. You look at our neighbors, Allentown, Lancaster, Bethlehem, Philly, Pittsburgh. These cities are not doing this, I don't think, because they are more environmentally conscious or they care more about climate change than we do. But they recognize 2 important facts. The first is that the actions you take to address climate change can make you a stronger community. And the second is that you can market and brand yourself as a sustainable community, an attractive place to live and work and play, and use this kind of work to revitalize and bring people back into your community. Last week, we heard from Heidi about the state's climate action plan, which is trying to meet that goal of an 80% reduction by 2050. And this is really what we're going to use as our model here in Reading. Heidi talked about some different strategies. Number one, energy efficiency. That's something that makes sense here in Reading. We can do that. Same thing, number 18, leading by example with local government. That's something we can do. Number 8, agricultural best practices. That's probably not the best one for the city of Reading because we don't have a lot of agriculture within the city limits. So part of our goal is going to be finding which strategies make the most sense for Reading. So let's talk about that. The city is starting a leadership role by a greenhouse gas inventory and a climate action plan. So last fall, we completed a greenhouse gas inventory. What that means is we took estimates of all of the emissions from our community and broke them out by sector. So thank you to MedEd, to UGI, to the Planning Commission, to everyone who helped provide the data for us. What we found was that energy consumption was responsible for about 75% of all emissions in our community. Transportation was the next largest sector with close to 20%. And then solid waste, process emissions, waste and wastewater treatment were a much smaller piece. Industrial energy was the single biggest source of emissions with over 44% of our entire community's emissions. In the transportation sector, the railroad, the buses, freight vehicles are represented, but the largest source of emissions is simple passenger vehicles using gasoline. So that's you and I driving our cars as well as normal gasoline fleets for businesses, governments, and institutions. On the waste side, waste is pretty hard for us to estimate, but we do know that the commercial waste is probably much larger impact than the residential waste. So that's an opportunity to work with many different partners on addressing that sector. What we do with all of this is we take our data, which was 2016 data, and we do what we call forecasting. So we look at each of those sectors and we say, how will those emissions change over time given the level of growth we expect in our community? So this shows a low level of growth. And you can see the business as usual, no changes. We'll see an increase over time in all sectors of our emissions. We're also modeling a little bit higher level of growth, and we can measure a very high level of growth because we know that Reading is very interested in revitalizing and attracting new businesses and new people to our community. The green dotted line is kind of an interim goal, and the red dotted line at the bottom represents our 2050 goal of reducing emissions by 80%. So as you can see, no matter which forecast we look at, we do have quite a bit of work to do to meet our goal by 2050. So that's what we're doing now. The second half of this effort is the climate action plan. That's what this workshop's all about. What our first step is drafting a climate action plan for Reading, figuring out which strategies make the most sense. And we're using a template through the program Heidi talked about last week, which is run through the DEP. And we are getting information from you guys, but eventually we'll do some public input, public feedback. We'll have to adopt the plan, implement the plan, and then this is going to, of course, be a living document. We're talking about 30 years of planning, so we're going to have to revisit this as we achieve our goals, as technology and situations change. We're going to incorporate what we saw last week from Heidi, which is modeling that business as usual, modeling that slope graph, the dotted line, where we want to be, and then starting to fill in which strategies will accomplish how much of our emissions. Heidi mentioned that we had a gray area here, which is things that haven't been modeled. And it's okay if we don't have all the answers right now, but we need to get started because the longer we take to start, the harder it's going to be to meet our goals. We're going to look at things like cost effectiveness. Again, this is from Heidi's presentation. Things like simply reducing how much we drive, all the way on the left, actually have a net public benefit. It benefits our public health, it reduces local air pollution, and it reduces emissions. On the other end, sustainable, clean public transportation, We all want that rail line to Philadelphia. Really great resource for our community, but also may have a higher cost. So we need to look at all these different options. So let's talk a little bit about some projects the city has undertaken or is working on now. A major shout out to Reading 400. We have a couple people from the group on here today, as well as the Environmental Advisory Council for the city, also a couple members here today. They worked together last year to draft a resolution, which the city's city council passed, and it committed our community to 100% clean renewable energy by 2050. That's really exciting. It's really been a spark for this effort. And now we are joining many Americans, where 1 in 4 people in America actually live in a community who's made this commitment. If we just look at that goal, 100% clean renewable energy by 2050, and we put that into our forecasts, we can see that although that goal is going to be challenging and we don't necessarily know all the steps we need to take it, we know that doing it will dramatically reduce our emissions and will get us quite a bit of the way to our goal. And that's what we're doing with this process, is evaluating different options and showing these forecasts to see how do we get to where we want to be. I am extremely excited to announce that as of March, 100% of the city's electricity is sourced from carbon-free emissions. Back in 2018, we worked on our contracting, and in 2019, we saved the city about $400,000 a year on electricity. And now this year, we've been able to maintain those same savings and eliminate the carbon emissions. The city accounts for about 7% of the energy emissions in the commercial sector. So we're taking a leadership role and really trying to get the ball rolling. Additional projects, speaking of energy, one thing we're very interested in doing is aggregating, which means working with other groups like the school district or the housing authority to purchase renewable energy together, where we can actually use our larger purchasing power to get a better deal and increase our renewable energy in the community. We're working on LED street lighting upgrades, and we're doing energy audits and energy efficiency projects at public buildings. On the right, you can see an Act 129 flyer. If you don't know about this, you absolutely need to. You're already paying for energy efficiency on your electric bill, whether you are at home or at your organization. You can get rebates for investing in efficient lighting and efficient equipment at your property. And so you should definitely be taking advantage of that as well. Transportation, we are looking at electric vehicle charging stations. The Doubletree downtown actually has a handful of these, and other groups in the community have shown interest and are working on getting some. In the waste sector, we are doing waste and recycling audits. We're working on clean city efforts. We're trying to reduce our waste. And in water, there's a lot of education around MS4, stormwater management, both at the city level, groups like Master Watershed Stewards, and the Planning Commission. So there's a lot of work already happening both in the city and in the larger community. So with that, I do want to recap quickly. It's very important for us to remember that climate change affects everyone, and it affects frontline populations the most. And it's already happening now. Our children and our grandchildren will be most likely to be facing the most extreme effects of climate change. And we know here locally, those are likely to be heat, severe weather, flooding, and all the secondary effects that come with those. Our overall goal is really to build a stronger, more resilient Reading, a strong economy, a clean environment, and a connected, cohesive, and healthy society where we care equally about people and place and profit. And the goal of this workshop really is to learn, both for you guys to learn what we're doing, but also to learn from all of you and to gather input so we can understand what our priorities need to be, what partnerships we might utilize, and really help us draft that climate action plan. I'm almost out of time here, so I'm gonna wrap up with a couple ways that you can all be part of the solution. So you can take direct action. You can perform energy audits, energy efficiency projects at your facilities, and you can utilize those Act 129 rebates to do that. You can purchase clean renewable energy. These days, it's actually cost competitive for an organization, and you can also do it at home. And with your organization, you can partner with other groups to aggregate your demand and get a better deal with more clean power. Shout out to those of us on this call who bike or walk or use transit to get to work or take a carpool, at least during normal times. You can provide commuter support. And as we're learning to work remotely, that might be an option in the future. Maybe one day a week, some of your employees are able to work from home and cut down on their commute. You can also support. You can educate your organization directly with the things that you've learned here today and in other areas. And you can also host an educational workshop. You can invite the city, the master watershed stewards. There's a variety of groups out there who would love to come and speak to your organization. You can support the Berks County's adoption of CPACE, which Heidi mentioned last week, which essentially is a new structure, if you will, to help businesses invest in clean energy and invest in energy efficiency in a way that is easier and more convenient for them. And of course, you can always contact your state, your federal legislators to support the key initiatives. We heard about about Pennsylvania's cap and trade program, RGGI, that we might be joining, and the Pennsylvania Alternative Energy Portfolio Standard, which has increased renewables in the state. Those are just two examples of things happening at the state level that can really, really help, and we need support for our legislators to pursue those. So that's about it. I think we have a couple extra minutes here. I'm going to turn it over to Scott and let him continue facilitating.